I'll wait a couple of minutes and let everyone join.
Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our third in our GovCon Board Mission Critical webinar series. Today's topic is Inside DOL Investigations. My name is Archisha Meehan, and I'm the executive in charge for Fedmine. I am happy to be joined today by a wonderful panel. Eric Crusius from partner at Holland & Knight, Jim Campbell, CEO and founder at Axum Fringe Solutions Group, and Pete Ragone, Audit Director at SCA&H. Our agenda for today is just a quick hello from Fedmine, introductions of our panel, and then into our panel discussion. We will be sending out the recording later on today or early tomorrow, along with the slides. And I would request that we hold, any questions that you might have, please use the Q&A chat box so that we can respond to those properly. Fedmine is a business intelligence platform that analyzes and simplifies the increasingly complex federal business landscape in real time. We integrate data from 17 data sources. Leela, if you want to go to the next slide. And most of them are in real time. So today I would to get into our introductions. Eric Crusius is a partner at Holland & Knight, specializing in government contracts and represents businesses of all shapes and size. He was named a Super Lawyers Rising Star, a top honor given to only the top 2.5% of attorneys. Jim Campbell is founder and CEO of Axum Fringe Solutions Group. The company provides consulting, benefits administration, and DOL ACA compliance services for wage determination contracts. A veteran, Jim is committed to help his clients find the best solutions for their businesses. Thank you, Jim, for your service. Our moderator for today is Pete Ragone, Audit Director at SCA&H Group and the GC industry team leader. With over 30 years of experience working with publicly held and private companies, Pete works with his clients to provide meaningful recommendations that affect him. With that, I am going to hand it over to Pete and the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Fedmine, again, for hosting. This is, as you mentioned, session 3 of a 3-part series covering all things SCA, DBA, Service Contract Act, Davis-Bacon Act, with my esteemed panelists, Jim Campbell of Axum and Eric Crusius of Holland & Knight. The 3 of us are all part of the GovCon Board, which is a group of individuals and companies who are put together these presentations, and our goal is to help government contractors achieve their goals. I do want to thank everyone that's part of the GovCon Board who have helped put these together, including not just SCA&H, myself, and Eric and Jim, and Fedmine, but also the Capital Group that provides benefit analysis and wealth planning, the government contractors, Republic Capital Access that provides alternative financing to government contractors, RGE, Bob Ganji, Consulting Services, who has many years of banking and consulting expertise for government contractors to help them grow. Scott Mendelson, Edge Realty, helping government contractors meet their commercial leasing needs, whether they're upsizing or downsizing. Alan Luba and Human Resources, company that provides all things HR in the GovCon space, and Paylocity, a payroll service provider, specializing in government contractor, and Jack Longenacre, Spartan Shield Solutions, that provides outsourced accounting and finance services. So really great group of people, and our goal is just to help educate and and be a resource for government contractors. But so here we are, session 3. We learned a lot so far, even myself, from Jim and Eric about SCA and DBA compliance. And now we're going to jump into something that I know is very prevalent and hot and heavy out there, as Jim and Eric have been on the front lines of Department of Labor investigations. So I'm just going to kick it off with, what do you do when it starts? You're a company, you get this notice that they're getting investigated. So I'll just kick it off to whoever wants to start first, the attorney or the benefits guy.
Well, I always tell clients to curl up in the fetal position and don't leave your room for a year, and then hopefully it'll go away by then. Jim, I'll just jump in unless you want to, but I mean, the first thing to do is to think about why this investigation, sorry, my cat's walking by here, why this investigation is happening. Oftentimes a company knows that there is a reason that there's an investigation. They've gotten complaints from employees before. They have, they know of shortfalls in their compliance systems with respect to SCA, DBA, or other labor issues. So the first thing is to kind of try to figure out, what's the cause of this investigation. Some investigations are random. Some investigations are based on an employee complaint. So, if there's an initiative announced that the government's going to audit all security contractors in the Dallas metro area, and you're in the Dallas metro area and you're a security contractor, then that's why it started. If it's complaint-based, it's really a good idea to try to figure out where it came from and how big of a problem this could be. You'd be surprised how many times I talk to clients and they kind of have that idea of where the problem is. Is this a $1,000 problem or is this a $1 million problem? And that kind of analysis will helps the client understand, what are the next steps that they should take. Should they bring in outside counsel or Jim or Pete or whoever to help them through the investigation and the aftermath? Obviously a $1,000 problem is quite a bit different than $1 million problem in the consequences too. DOL is going to have a lot more resources on a big issue. They'll also maybe seek the ultimate penalty for a contractor, debarment for 3 years, if it's a large number, even if it's the first investigation. So the very first thing to do when an investigation starts is to kind of gather information, figure out how big a problem this is, and that will then guide what the next steps should be as we go through the roadmap of the investigation.
Well, there's the attorney answer, Jim.
Yeah, I would add to that, I think the vast majority of investigations come on from an employee complaint. Over the years, if anybody's looked at the DOL folders or posters that they send out, that 800 number has gotten really big and really bold, more and more every single year. If you just take a note, it's crazy how it's changed. And I believe the 2 past secretaries ago said, we're not going to use our own people, we'll just use your people to find where the issues are. I mean, he made that in a public statement. So they have adopted by that. Employees know how to dial that 800 number very quickly. Whether right, wrong, or indifferent, if they feel slighted, they can dial that number and that could spur an investigation. To Eric's point, it's not going to go away lightly. You have to have your ducks in a row. And if you're doing compliance, in-house compliance, your spreadsheets better be accurate and you better be able to talk through them, and you need to call an attorney, right? So I would find Eric's number painted everywhere on the internet, and I would make sure that you know how to get a hold of him at Holland & Knight, because you're going to need an attorney to answer these questions. Because we've substantiated 200 plus investigations on behalf of our clients. And I can tell you every single one of them came down to our firm providing very diligent reporting, very time, date, and stamped transactional models of when money came in and money came out, who was what benefit was on what employee's behalf. If you don't have those types of detailed records, you're in for a ride, and you need to have an attorney with you.
And I think it's a great point that Jim makes, because what DOL is going to do is they're going to assume that whatever the employees are saying as far as how many hours they worked and what vacation they took is going to be true, absent records from the employer showing otherwise. And oftentimes, I'm not saying it's on purpose, but oftentimes the employee believes they've worked more than the employer believes. So there's certainly going to be a shortfall in paying benefits in that instance, which, like Jim said, will be a wild or difficult ride from then on out. So that's why having those records is so important. And like what Jim said, he's provided those records over and over again. And that's why it's, if you can't do it internally, having a third party that can do that makes a big difference in an investigation, and have everything in a nice package for DOL to come in and look at.
Yeah, and I can add, as an auditor, not these type of audits, but I have done incurred cost audits as well as financial statement audits. It's all about how good the records are. Absolutely, they got to be clean, and they can't be overly complex. They really need to make sense. And it's not a court of law, right? There's no innocent until proven guilty. They're going to come in and hey, if there's been a whistleblower, they're going to assume something's wrong, and you got to prove there's not.
Right.
Yeah, and like especially with SCA, there's no private right of action in court for employees who complain about the SCA. So the DOL takes it as they are the counsel almost for the SCA whistleblower. So it's not like Pete said, it's not going to be this neutral investigation. It's going to be more of an advocacy role that they play with respect to those employees. That being said, the communications with the investigator should be very professional and nice. If there's somebody in the company who might fly off the handle a little bit in the face of an investigation, they should not be anywhere near the investigator, because those investigators have a lot of power. They can decide whether to ramp up or open the scope of the investigation, to narrow it. They can recommend future further action against the company. Now the investigators' bosses don't have to agree with those recommendations, but often they do. They're very persuasive usually. So, as a start, treating the investigator well, trying to be responsive to them. And we can talk more about this as we go through the roadmap of an investigation, but having the right attitude going in, even if you don't want them to be there, because you presumably will not want them to be there, is important.
Would you say the immediate thing not to do would be start shredding things?
That would be my recommendation. There's a legal term called spoliation, and you don't want to do that.
Well, since you mentioned roadmap, I think that's a good segue. Let's talk about this roadmap of what it looks like from the very beginning, where you get the notice, and through the process. And does it depend on if it's SCA versus DBA?
Not really, as Jim kind of noted. And Jim, I'll kind of go through a roadmap, but feel free to jump in, of course, because I know you're involved in a lot of these and at different various points. But it usually starts with some kind of letter or email or something like that that says, we're going to, in non-COVID times, maybe we're going to come in for an in-person conference. Please have these records ready when I get in to interview the company or before. So each one's a little bit different. Sometimes you need to do the records before, sometimes the records at the initial conference. Now with COVID times, a lot of times these initial conferences are over the phone or by video, Teams or whatever. So, you'll have a job to gather those documents. Sometimes the documents will kind of help provide a roadmap of what the investigation is about. If they're asking about one particular contract or a particular census of people within a contract, then that kind of gives you an idea of the scope of the investigation and what it's about, at least initially. That being said, DOL has the power and the right, whether you like it or not, to ask for a wide swath of documents concerning compliance with various labor laws, not just SCA and Davis-Bacon Act. So while the initial investigation might be about one thing, it could morph into something else, I should say. So, but the initial thing is you're going to get a letter or a communication of some kind from DOL saying we've opened an investigation. They won't say whether it's complaint-based or based on a random audit, but as Jim said, most of them are complaint-based. And from there, it's time to gather records. Now, sometimes these records that they ask for are just really overbearing and more than can be possibly gathered efficiently or economically, because sometimes they're in storage and this and that. So it's okay to have that communication with the investigator saying, hey, we can provide you with these records, but these other records are really difficult to get or take more time. Can we just provide these first tranche of records first and see if you need the second one? Or, if you just need more time, say, hey, my lawyer needs to review these records before they go out, and he or she is always on the golf course, so it's going to be a couple weeks. Is that okay? So there's ways to kind of approach it where you're not providing everything at the same time, which may be physically impossible to do, because the reality is the investigator is going to be reviewing these records themselves. They're probably not going to be able to review, 10,000 pages of records within a week. So if you kind of give it to them in steps, that's generally okay, as long as they don't think you're trying to evade or trying to take the time to shred, as Pete joked about, shred them in advance. So that's kind of what happens before the conference. And even before then, if it was based on a complaint, some employee or worker for the company had gone to DOL and filed a complaint. DOL does an initial look at it and asks for records to back up the employee's allegations. The employee then shows the records to DOL, and then that's when DOL reaches out to the company if they think like there might be something there. It's not a high bar that has to be passed. And then from that, you have the record gathering, and then you have the initial conference with the investigator. The investigator will kind of talk about the scope of the investigation, what they're looking for. They'll ask the company about SCA compliance, and they'll take the records and take them back to their office. Employee interviews usually don't happen in the initial conference, but those happen down the road. So as we go through the roadmap, we could talk about that a little bit more. But that initial meeting is really important. It's important to affirm your commitment to complying with the SCA or DBA in that meeting. And it's important to announce that you're going to be cooperative and do anything that you can to make sure that that DOL gets the records that they need. Obviously, if DOL asks for records, like I said before, that seem to be unreasonable or too much or too expensive, have that communication with DOL, because sometimes they will be accommodating about that. Oftentimes they will be, especially if it's just a delay where you provide some documents initially and then other documents, in a week or two time. So, and the last point I'm going to make about this initial meeting is what I mentioned before, is you want to have folks within the company who are going to treat the meeting seriously and also be cooperative and not push back too much on the investigator in that initial conference. Because if an investigator is pushed back on, they're going to get their back up too. And it's just going to make the investigation a lot more contentious, a lot worse, and probably have worse outcomes. And in the end, it's not going to do the company any good, because the DOL has a right to be there and they have a right to ask for those documents.
Yeah, I would actually agree with everything that Eric said and add to, in that initial investigation, when you agree to comply, offer to have all of your documents ready and for review. What do you need, right? If you do the compliance in-house and you feel that you're truly doing the compliance, this is a push of a button in today's world, right? So your time and attendance is a push of a button, so you can show what employees work what hours. If you're doing the compliance on a spreadsheet, you can pull the spreadsheet up at any time, right? So be very amenable to wanting to get this to go away, because that's what the auditors want as well. They want an open conversation and they want you to be right. It's not like they're just looking for you to be wrong. They want you to be right and doing everything possible for the employees. So if you can prove that, offer to do it right then and there. A lot of our clients will just call us and say, hey, it's time to step in. Great. Introduce ourselves, sit down with the investigator. How can we best get this information to you? What format works best for you? And it's a very cordial conversation. We've never had any contentious confrontations, and it's never gotten out of pocket. You might have to explain things multiple times and in different ways, and showing it different ways, same information in different ways. That's just life, right? The longer you drag it out, though, the worse off it will be for you, because they will find something. If you're doing it in-house, you have the liability and the burden of proof is on you. They will find something. So you want to get this open and closed as quickly as possible.
It's a good point.
I'm just going to ask Jim, since you've been on the front lines, given, COVID, things were starting to loosen up now with Delta. Quarantining seems to be more prevalent again, it looks like. Have you noticed a change in how they're able to do it? Have they been able to do things remotely? I know the DCA has been doing some of those things. How has the DOL handled this? And frankly, I think this is an opportunity for companies to get digital when instead of relying on hard copies. But have you noticed anything there that's that they've done to either help or hinder?
Eric and I joked about this throughout the year. Enforcement has rapidly ramped up. It's not even close. I mean, the beginning of this year, we saw 8 times the activity. We did a study from December of 2020 into May of 2021. We had 8 times the request for information because it is digital. They don't have to go anywhere. They don't need to just show up in your office and sit around the beltway and, you know, bang their head against traffic. They don't want to do that either. So they've gotten to a point where they're like, okay, send us the information. And if you can't diligently and comprehensively walk somebody through that information, your information's wrong and it's not that good. So you should be able to provide that information and talk somebody through it very easily. And again, the investigators that we found that we work with have said, this is the complaint that was received. It applied to this employee, but while we're here, let's see what you've done for the company. If you can't do that, which is to Eric's point earlier, is their right. It's their job actually to do that, to make sure you're doing everything for the entire population that's subjected to this. You should have no problem providing for one or all the employees. And that's, I think, the biggest reason companies outsource this type of work, right? They'll retain a law firm, an accounting firm, somebody like that, somebody like our firm, to be able to say, this is getting to be too much. I want to grow the company and I can't do this. This is what you guys focus on. You're better, faster, smarter at it. Help us take care of this. Because the DOL's gotten better, faster, smarter too.
Now, Eric, you mentioned that they could broaden the scope. What kind of time period do they typically look at, and how far back can they go? Are there statute of limitations?
There's no limit to how far back they can go. Traditionally, it's been 2 years if they thought that something that the contractor, didn't do anything purposefully. They just, if their initial feeling is that the contractor might have messed something up, they'll look back 2 years. If they think it's more than that, they'll look back 3 years. But I've seen them go back further than that, even in a normal situation. So the investigator has a lot of discretion as far as how back they want to go. DOL does. And I've seen them go back further. But traditionally, you're looking at 2 or 3 years back. It also may depend on the length of the contract. So if the contract is like 3.5 years old, maybe they'll just go back to 3.5 years because that's where the contract began. So it could vary a lot, but traditionally it's 2 to 3 years that they look back.
Right. And I assume it's similar to, say, IRS. If there's any indicator of fraud, or if they find fraud, then all bets are off. They'll go back as far as they need to. Right.
And I think I missed your other question before. They can look at any, like you said, they could look at anything. They might come in for FLSA, investigation. Then they say, oh, this company has government contracts. Let's look at their SCA compliance as well. Or it could broaden from one SCA contract to 10 SCA contracts, where they initially look at one contract. Maybe they find things aren't as they would like. So they see what the other contracts are looking like. So, and like Jim said a few times, they have the right to do that. They have the right to make it as broad as they want. They have the right to ask for whatever they want. So in that regard, you're kind of helpless. But how you package it to them, to Jim's point, is really important. If you provide a neat package for them to look at, it'll make things go a lot quicker. And that fetal position for a year might be only 6 months instead.
In between getting them their documents.
Right, yeah.
Or let the people who know how to get the documents, and the ones who want to worry can be up in a fetal position somewhere.
Yeah.
And so we talked a little bit of the roadmap. I don't know if there's more to cover on that, but it sounds like they have very broad reach to grab it. What are some things, you mentioned they can do, or what about things they cannot do during an investigation? I think that's important.
I mean, they can't make like the company say things, right? Or like, there's not a lot. I know, because I brought up this point. There's not a lot that they cannot do.
Okay.
When you think about the lane that they're in, the DOL lane, and they're asking for documents, they're allowed to interview your employees, and you still pay them for that time. They're allowed to come on the premises to do that. mean, certainly if the premises that the employees are on is controlled, and you need a security clearance, they can't go and do that if they don't have a security clearance, or if they, whatever security clearance you're working under doesn't permit visitors like that. But there's a lot of flexibility about what they can do. I mean, obviously, if they show up unannounced, they want to come into your corporate offices and look at your records physically themselves, they can't do that. You can tell them no. But aside from the kind of those more outlandish scenarios, there's not a lot of limits on what they can't do. I don't know, Jim, what have you seen anything on the cannot?
I would just say that they can't treat you differently based on the same type of complaint that they would have somebody else, right? So there's no malice or ill intent. It's like everybody has to get treated with the same, or painted with the same brushstroke, which is altruistically fair, right? Unfortunately, that's a really wide brushstroke. To Eric's point, they can go in and ask for a lot of things. So the don't list, I would just say that if it's right for one, it's right for all, right? As long as it's ethical and all that. The only other thing too is, I would say on the watch out list is you cannot, as the employer, prevent them from doing certain things like talking to employees. They have those rights, like Eric said. And when you become confrontational, we saw this last year with an employer, it didn't work out well, right? So you are going to get demand letters that you don't want to deal with. And certain issues can have a carryover into taxes and back pay issues. And now you can involve the IRS. So again, it always makes sense to play ball, be courteous, and have your records ready, right? And keep your ducks in a row. Other than that, you're going to lose. It's a losing game if you try to be too contentious.
That's a great point. And you're mentioning, it's not just DOL, but right, if they find something that somehow can involve IRS getting involved, then yep, there's a whole nother can of worms that have been opened up, and more data requests, and you just go down that rabbit hole that you don't want to go down to.
Yeah, and look, I'll throw myself on the fire here. Eric's been great in helping us with this, but if you're using a third-party administrator and you're getting this perceived pressure from the DOL that they're not receiving what they want, you have a third party that's doing these services for you. It's their responsibility to step in and help you, right? That's what we do as a charge. That doesn't mean that the DOL has to deal with us. We've had investigations, and Eric can attest to this, where they've just been like, that's great, and we'll take all the information they have, but we're still talking to you, Mr. or Mrs. Employer. You're the responsible ones here. And we don't care what XYZ is saying. Now we get over that hurdle, but they can push too, right? And that's something that you have to be conscientious of, because these investigations cost money. They cost time. And when it costs time, it's going to cost money. And then you have outside resources like Eric that you want to have ready to come in and shorten that time. It's really what you want to have.
That makes, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I think that's a great point by Jim. So just kind of working through the roadmap, Pete, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So once they gather the records, they'll review them. They'll seek to interview some employees. It gets a little sticky sometimes because some employees, especially if English is not their first language or they're new to the country, may be very intimidated by being interviewed by somebody at DOL. So as an employer, you have to treat that very carefully. You don't want to be seen to be discouraging those employees from talking to DOL. But they're allowed to do that on premises. Obviously with COVID, things are a little bit different, but for the most part, they're allowed to do that on premises, and then, kind of juxtapose the records that they have with the employee interviews. They'll have records from the employees, potentially they'll have their interviews, and they'll have records from the employer, and then kind of trying to get all those to fit together and see if it makes sense. And then at some point, the investigator will come up with a conclusion as far as, if they think there was a violation and the magnitude of violation and what statutes were violated. One thing I should have mentioned, there's a few different requirements under SCA and DBA, but one of them is a notification requirement. That's having one of those things is having a poster in the workplace. Got to have that poster in the workplace. If there's a physical inspection and DOL doesn't see that poster, that's a sign that there are a lot of things that are wrong, because that's pretty much the easiest thing you can do is put up a poster.
Yeah, that's the low-hanging fruit.
That's exactly right. That's right. And I know as an auditor, you're all about the low-hanging fruit and getting that taken care of. So, having all those kind of things set when the employer, when DOL comes is also pretty vital. But they'll review everything. They'll come up with a conclusion. They'll state which statutes they think were violated, and they'll issue a WH-56, which is a form that has the employees' names on it, their address, I think, as well as the statute that was violated and the amount of back wages that's owed. And they'll give that to you at the final conference and say, this is how much you need to pay your employees. And then from there, all chaos breaks out.
I'm sure, because now there's real money involved, right? Now, to your point about, let's say there's a language barrier. Who's responsible for getting a translator? Is it DOL, or is the company going to pay for that?
I mean, usually DOL will do something like that. If you have a translator on site, I could see, them asking the company translator, but that's more of on the unusual side. But that's something that DOL will provide.
I would think they'd want to, because they're trusting the translator to actually translate correctly.
Yeah. Yeah. The translator said the employees are overpaid. Oh boy. Time to get a new translator.
Yeah.
And sometimes I've seen this before too, where the investigator, may speak Korean and the employee population is Korean, and they'll match that up so the investigator can talk to those employees in their native language, which makes things a little bit smoother. Of course, if it goes down the road, you're going to have to try to figure out a way to interview those employees potentially in a litigation. But, that's generally what happens.
Yeah. Jim, have you had to handle any of that from your end as a third-party administrator with what you do and provide for your clients, or you typically rely on the company at that point?
No, it's a great question. As of, I believe, June, we had 13 languages involved in one of our largest national clients. And that was something that we, as the administrator, paid for, because we have those resources and we could make sure that we had folks properly ask the questions to the people in their, provided language, their native language. Korean was big. Vietnamese is another one that's big. Hindi is big, right? So we had to have this ready as far as the employer, getting the employer covered to say, are these questions, are you comfortable with these? Are these really what you intended to say type things? And what we did find was a lot of them were language issues, right? They were on the job site, they were getting asked the question. Somebody at the job site was giving them kind of hand signals on what to answer and shaking their head, yes or no. And these employees were kind of going along with it, but they did not have any valid reason or backup or validity to those arguments. So we found out that a lot of it wasn't accurate, but the employees that did start the mess at the union level, they were kind of the fire starters, right? And they were trying to get people to rally behind the cry. And it ended up going nowhere, right? It took 3.5 months, cost the employer some money, cost us some time and money, but it ended up going nowhere and came back favorable for the employer that they were doing everything right. That's one of the unfortunate parts. It's a cost of doing business.
Yes, it is. You have your rabble rousers, as they want to stir it up, especially unions, and they're going to see what they can get out of the company.
Right.
So what is, I see somebody asked, what is there a typical timeline, average time on these investigations? And Eric, you seem to allude that it could be 6 months or longer. What is a typical time frame?
I mean, for a basic soup to nuts investigation, 4 to 6 months, but oftentimes they're longer than that. It depends on the complexity, depends on whether the scope has changed, is expanded during the course of the investigation. It also depends, is there a tricky legal issue, right? Is the company kind of saying, that whatever the issue is not an issue? Because a lot of times DOL will attack these gray areas, to put it generously, where, the lawyer representing the company, and the company may say, and the benefits provider, TPA, may say, no, that this is right. What the company is doing is correct. and DOL may have a different thought about it, and it takes them a while to kind of figure that out. I'm not saying that in a derogatory sense, but they want to, the idea is to get it right, not to get it fast. So those kinds of investigations that have changing scope, tricky legal issues, that kind of thing will last longer. I've heard of them lasting a few years for really large scale ones where, what happened, these investigations usually aren't a daily thing. So even in the 6 months investigation, you may have 4, 5, 6 contacts with the investigator, on average once a month then.
Right.
The ones that last like a year or two may be kind of seemingly dormant for months at a time. And it could be that the investigator is doing other things that have a higher priority. It could be that they're just working in the background. But it's kind of like litigation like that, where you have a case even in federal court where they move quicker, where there'll be a month or two and not really anything happens. And it's just because of the schedule, how everything is in place. So long story short, 6 months at a minimum, probably, and then it can go much longer.
Does it matter whether they're a prime or a sub on a contract that's getting investigated? And
Not too much.
If there is prime or sub, do they typically rope in the prime if it is a sub, or vice versa if they're pushing things down and they say, well, hey, the prime, you're not doing it right. Let's get into the subs.
No, that's actually a multi-layered question there.
Yes, it is. Sorry.
That's all right. That's what we're here for. If it's it won't take any longer, probably, just because there's a prime sub process involved or a prime sub relationship involved. Although, if they're going to this, if the subcontractor is the one that probably has the violation, if there is a violation, one step they're gonna take is asking the prime contractor, what kind of communications have you had with the sub about SCA or DBA or whatever compliance? Well, let me see your contract documents between the two of you. So because the sub may be claiming, I had no idea that I had to comply with this, right? And then DOL is going to want to try to verify that. So that kind of little side detour may add a week or two to the investigation in general. But besides that, investigations involving prime sub relationship probably shouldn't take much longer, because they're still going to be looking at the same documents overall. Of course, anything with the prime and sub is a little bit more complicated, because in the end, the prime is ultimately responsible for what the sub does, right and wrong. So if there is a violation and the sub is not paying it, then DOL is going to come to the prime contractor and get that paid, and have the prime contractor pay those back wages for those subcontractor employees. So as a side tip, really make sure that subcontract agreement is really solid, so the prime contractor can withhold funds from the sub, or have an easy way to kind of seek those back wages that are being collected by DOL. And then it gets really sticky if the sub disagrees with the back wage determination and DOL goes to the prime to get the money. So you have a situation where the sub and DOL are disagreeing, and the prime's kind of caught in the middle. So the prime should have regular dialogue with DOL and the subcontractor to determine what the next steps are, because maybe DOL is wrong. And so the prime's going to back up the sub, or maybe DOL is right, and the prime's trying to push the sub to comply or to pay the back wages, and they can't. So the language of the subcontract will be very important, because what happens if there's that kind of disagreement? What does the subcontract say about that?
Right.
That's a really big point. That's a really big point that subs need to be. I think subs and primes really need to be cognizant of, because we often don't see that dispute clause. And a lot of times subs are saying, I don't either have the money, I didn't do anything wrong, or the sub gets a letter and says, hey, what the heck is going on? And it's a small amount of money, we just want this to go away. The sub says, it's not a small amount of money to us, and we didn't do anything wrong, and we're going to fight it. We had a prime jump the shark and just pay the invoice. They held the funds from the sub, and then they got into a legal battle, and I, being the third-party administrator for both of them, had to step away, because I said, we did everything right. You jumped the shark and paid what I felt was prematurely just to make this go away, but you didn't have anything in writing that you could do that and hold this group's money from them. Yeah. And ultimately the prime ended up losing the lawsuit.
Wow.
So
Yeah, they took action when they didn't need to. And
Yeah, and it was
ended
it
up
was an
costing them in the
immaterial
long
amount of
run.
money.
Yeah.
To them, it was immaterial, but in
Well,
the
yeah,
grand scheme of things, it became a big deal.
yeah. That could have made things even worse, and you damage relationships too, right? When you hear these things, if you're a sub and people talk and they're like, that prime, you may want to be careful.
It goes both ways though, because then the prime
Well,
can come
that's true too.
with a sub,
Yeah, that is true. Like anything. From when is the core contracting officer involved, or are they ever, Eric?
If you give a contracting officer truth serum, they'll tell you that they don't want DOL to be there if the contract's running well.
Right.
Their biggest priority is that the contract is working well, the contractor is delivering on time, on budget.
Right.
If that's all happening,
they don't want problems.
Yeah, no problems. Stay away. Please stay away, DOL. So if you give them truth serum, they'll say that they'd rather not DOL be there in a well-functioning contract. That being said, in some ways they're subservient to DOL because if there's a couple of scenarios here. Let's just say the agency didn't put in the SCA clause and wage termination as an example, and DOL comes in, does an investigation, says there should be an SCA clause and wage termination here. They can essentially force the agency to put those clauses into the contract retroactively. They restart the investigation and then find that the contractor violated clauses that were not in their contract. And the remedy for the contractor is then to put in a price adjustment from the agency and get it. That's why it's really important to kind of, if you don't see the clauses in your contract initially or in the solicitation, you think it's applicable to ping the agency about it so you don't run into that issue. You will get your money back from the agency, but
that'll take time.
Yeah.
You
know that all too well, Pete, right?
Yeah, it's going to take a lot of time, and attorneys, because unless they have an in-house who's familiar with following requests for equitable adjustment, price adjustments. Yeah.
So that's why it's just so important to kind of deal with those issues up front on the price adjustments to make sure that you're not stuck in that position where DOL does an investigation and in the end they will find that you violated the law. Now there should be a note in your file that this was an agency error, but I would certainly write a letter to DOL specifying that it was an agency error, so that's in your kind of permanent file. Besides that, the contracting officer doesn't play a huge role in this process. They're there in the background. The DOL may request records from them if they think like contract records that they're not getting from the contractor or subcontractor. They may have an interview with them, but they're not going to be the real folks who are involved are the company and DOL, and that's it. With the sideshow from the contracting officer, because if they put the clause in wage termination in, that's kind of where their role stops with this whole thing.
Yeah. So they're just sitting back with their fingers crossed. Please, nothing go wrong.
I love this contractor, right?
Yeah. Well, we're about 45 minutes in. I've seen a couple questions come up, but nothing on the Q&A. Someone did also ask, are there any incentives to quantity or workload or time to complete and I guess in a certain period of time with the investigators, or is it just like typical? I mean, I know IRS audits can drag on. It doesn't seem like there's any incentive to close things out quickly. If anything, I think the incentive is they want to find something to justify what they do. But what are your thoughts on that? I mean, it just depends?
Yeah, I mean, let's just say that you violated, which happens occasionally. There was a violation after like looking at things more closely, and it's a pretty massive violation. So there's going to be a big payout of back wages. Maybe that you're happy with that one going slower, so you can bank some cash in order to pay those back wages. Yeah. So that's an instance where, I had one where, you have the investigation stage, and then at the end of the investigation, DOL could determine, all right, is that the end of it? Or is there going to be, seeking a debarment of some kind? And you want to put sometimes you want to put those things off, even though it's a cloud, because you can get new contracts in the meantime while that's being done. So if you think you have a problem, sometimes kind of having things ride a little bit longer can be the right play. But it's really, like you said, Pete, it's really just a kind of an independent situation. So this is not legal advice. Don't take my word for it. You just have to see where your situation is. Sometimes it's better to speed it up and get it done and get it out if you think it's a small little problem or no problem at all. because not having them see every record that you've ever created is probably a good thing. Because I always say this, and Jim, you mentioned this before, in the life of any company, mistakes are just going to be made. It's inevitable. Companies are made up of humans, and humans make mistakes. We all do. Everyone on this call has made a mistake at some point in their lives, probably some point today. So you want to just be in the best position you can be for, if that mistake was made.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think on our previous two sessions, you cover SCA and what it is, and DBA and what it is and how it interacts. When it gets down to the investigation, they're going to act very much the same, right? Because you have to produce a lot of the same information. It's going to be time records, it's going to be wage, it's going to be health and welfare amount. Regardless, you want to make sure that, just like the previous two sessions, you want to make sure that your wage determinations are accurate. You want to make sure that you're paying people according to that wage determination. You want to make sure your health and welfare rates are exactly what they should be. You want to make sure that you're updating your health and welfare records or payments according to when the new guidance comes out, or you have direction otherwise. If you're doing all those things, that's setting you up for a good path. Now, the tracking, the actual practical application of that work, that comes down to diligence, right? And if you don't have the systems in place to do that, outsource it. Find somebody that does this, like us, or someone else that does this. Because if you get a knock on the door and you're not ready, after all those things that you took care of, wage determination, health and welfare rate, paying the right rates, collecting time accurately, that can all go for naught if you don't have records. You have to be able to produce the records. And the minute that you don't do that is when you're upside down. You're going to lose, because back wages, fines, penalties, that's overhead. You're not able to roll that into your contract to get reimbursed for it, not doing the right things. So you cannot afford these types of missteps with the DOL. And again, if it's severely egregious, to Eric's point, it can become an IRS issue, and it can become a debarment issue. These are things that you don't want to mess around with. And you want to make sure that you're doing everything you possibly can to appease any type or satisfy any type of investigation that might come up for any period of time, whether it's the typical 2 years, like Eric said, or they go deep and say, no, we want to see 5 years.
Yeah. They can go as long as they want, as long as the contract periods is what they're auditing covered. What about, you mentioned, Eric, potential or possible investigatory outcomes. So, you've been through the process. What are some of the outcomes? And Jim, you too, I mean, you've been on the end stages to see what happens. Is, kick it to Eric, and then you jump in with some of the things you've seen.
Sure. I mean, one outcome is obviously they find nothing wrong. And that's more typical on where they're sweeping an industry in a specific area, because it's not a complaint based.
Not a whistleblower, yeah.
Right. Jim had mentioned, they usually find something. That's true. I always liken it to like when somebody starts a presidential exploratory committee to determine whether they want to run for president. They always do. They have this exploratory phase. Well, DOL in their exploratory phase is always find something, or at least they think they do. So that's one possible outcome. And that's obviously the best outcome, is that they don't find anything. Then the another possible outcome, of course, is that they find something, and the magnitude of what they find will determine what happens next. Perhaps it was an agency mistake. Perhaps it was a small number. Perhaps this is the first violation. Once the payment is made to the employees on the back wages, that's probably the end of it. But if it's a multiple, violation situation, or a large violation, or DOL thinks that the contractor, is purposely evading or grossly negligently evading their requirements under these labor laws, they'll refer to the Solicitor General's office for potential next steps. And the Solicitor's office's goal is either to collect the back wages that the employer refuses to pay, and or seek debarment of the company. And sometimes they'll seek debarment as a way to force the payment of back wages. So they'll file a complaint, and the complaint with the administrative law judges at DOL, and in the complaint they'll ask for the back wages and they'll ask for debarment, and then you wind up settling by paying the back wages and not getting debarred. So it's kind of like a negotiation tactic there. But sometimes they file that with the intention of going through with it. And at that point, you have a whole full blown out litigation where you're deposing DOL, they're deposing your employees and your executives. You have a trial before the administrative law judge, you submit briefing, and then sometime after the briefing, the ALJ will make a ruling on whether there is a violation or not and the magnitude of that violation. And that usually occurs, like I said, if there's multiple violations, or if you're in a situation where the employer refuses to pay the back wages. But just because you get a disagreement with the investigator about the back wages, it doesn't have to go from that 0 to 60. There's in between steps where you could ask to speak to the supervisor or the district director and explain your legal position and why you think you're right, as far as why back wages aren't owed. It kind of escalates from there along the way.
Yeah, I would say that, 95% of the investigations that we've come across have been very amicable, very quick, and worked out because very detailed and organized records, right? And that's no pat on the back. It's just is what it is. The 5% that have been ongoing attack what Eric had called the gray areas earlier, where there's different interpretations of what is allowed and what's not allowed. And that seems to be a moving target now. That seems to be changing as of the last, 6 to 10, 12, 15 months. We kind of see it continually changing, but these gray areas keep getting wider, right? And what is empirical is what's been published and what's been practiced for years. And then what's in the gray areas are these nuanced beliefs, right? That takes a lot longer to prove out that we're finding, right? So that goes back to Eric's 6 months time frame, 8-month time frame. And those, it's not contentious, but it is a longer, more protracted type of outcome. Ultimately, we get to the same answer, the one that we originally found 2 months into it, right? Not 8 months. But that's what's happening nowadays, and you have to be prepared to handle all of those different types of gray area questions, I would say, and prove against them.
Yeah. Are you seeing more besides there's whistleblower, but I know we've been talking, is there certain things that they're looking at now in industry? Is it types of plans? Is it, captives or self-insured, or all of the above?
Yeah, I would say self-insured and captives have definitely grown a lot, for the simple fact that in the benefit space, people are trying to just stay above board and keep their fringe rates in alignment, right?
Right.
So we've seen that go way up, as we talked about previously. You have to dispense, if you're in this world, you have to dispense of the funds to a disinterested third-party trust. You have to have a fiduciary of those funds, and both the plan and the trust have to be reviewed and approved. Don't skip that step just because you want to self-fund, or a benefits broker told you that's where you want to be and self-funding is the greatest thing in the world. Don't skip the step of getting it reviewed, because if you're in my shoes as an administrator, we can't take you on. We can't help you because I'm not putting myself in the crosshairs of DOL and saying we're operating a trust, without review. That's not something that you want to do and bring on, because if you do that, you're opening yourself up to have them find something. And I'd ask for indemnification if it was demanded upon us, right? You're gonna force us to do this. It's fine. We'll do all the tracking and all the money moving and all those other things, but we're not going to be on the hook if DOL says, wait a second, we never reviewed and or approved this plan, and the plan didn't meet XYZ requirements. So you're setting yourself up for further obligations there. And I know there was a question that popped up.
Yeah, I don't know if that's something, Eric, if you saw that one, would a prime contractor be held liable for SCA and DBA payment rates if a WH 347 is received from a subcontractor?
Yeah, I mean, the weekly payroll forms, they will be if the payroll is wrong. It's just the nature of the beast. The prime is always going to, the DOL always has the hammer over the prime if the subcontractor made a mistake. And that kind of goes to like a larger point, like as a prime, should you audit your subcontractors? No, you're not an auditor. right?
Right.
But there are ways you can minimize risk by informing the subcontractor about what they should be doing, using official DOL, documents, so you don't get it wrong, but what they should be doing under these statutes. Hope that answered it.
Well, I think you mentioned too, right? The prime's got a built-in ability to recuperate any out-of-pocket that they have to cover for the sub. So ultimately, they have to have those clauses built in and withholdings or other ways to make the prime whole.
Yep.
So, well, we're down to about the last few minutes. Any suggestions or recommendations on what to do when an investigation is over, or how to handle? I guess it depends on what the outcome is.
Yeah, I mean, in general, because a lot of these start with a complaint, is try to avoid those complaints by having an open dialogue with workers and saying, hey, if you have a problem, if you think there's something wrong, if there's a mistake, come to us. There's not going to be retaliation, and we can get it fixed pretty quickly. And sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. But if the employee thinks that they're owed something and they're really not, have a pretty lengthy explanation as far as why. So getting, kind of training the employees to come to the employer first and resolving the issue. Because a lot of times they'll get paid faster that way too. If there's an issue and they show the employer how there is an issue, they'll get their back wages much sooner than if DOL does an investigation and we go through this whole rigmarole. So, everyone wins from something like that. And just, take lessons learned away from the investigation and say, all right, this is where we went wrong. This is where we went right. These are new procedures and processes we should have in place, or everything worked great. They didn't find anything wrong, and we should just give ourselves a pat on the back, sip some wine and call it a day. But there's always lessons and takeaways that you can have from something like this.
Yeah, I would say that you want to be clear, direct, and transparent from the get-go of the contract. As soon as those employees come on, you want to make sure that your employee handbooks are properly aligned for the work being done. So if it's SCA, DBA, you have your benefits and you have your health and welfare, all clearly delineated. And this is day one stuff. You want to have as many employee meetings as possible to describe how or what classification they fall in and how they'll receive their benefits and or cash if you provide it. You want to have that stuff clearly delineated, laid out, properly accessible. So if it's in a payroll or enrollment system, you want to have that. You want them to know where to get these things. And to Eric's point, if there's a question, you have resources internally. Feel free to ask. And as a third-party administrator, we always put our information out front. We want the employees to call. We want to support that employer to answer those questions, make it easier on them. And then if it's out of our bailiwick and it truly is an internal employee issue, the HR person is very well aligned to handle that and address it on a company matter basis. But I think the clear, direct, and transparent from day one is the biggest role, especially if you're rebadging employees, right? If you're bringing people over from maybe a contentious previous employment arrangement or there's been some issues, there's already mistrust, whether you're right, wrong, or indifferent, there's already mistrust built. You want to get way out ahead of that. You want to address any of that. You want to, especially if they're having to pay out PTO and these people are coming over and starting new benefits, you want to address all of those things and you want somebody that can help you with that.
Yeah, those are great points. And transparency, absolutely. Being helpful, not being obstructive. Those are all great points. And I think those are huge takeaways. If anybody's company is going through this, I can't impress enough about following that advice from Jim and from Eric. But we're hitting the clock. We're at an hour. Unless there's some other questions, but I think we covered a great deal. Really enjoyed presenting with you, Jim and Eric, and appreciate the GovCon board for putting these on. And we're going to have many more. Thank you, Fedmine. I believe the slides will be available to the participants as well as the previous two sessions. We did have a snafu on the first session, did not record, but we're looking to see if we can get a transcript together at some point. There was some great content on SCA. I know the second one was recorded and this one as well. So again, Eric, Jim, thank you. Our Chiza, everybody, Layla at Fedmine, and we hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the week. It's already Wednesday. I love these short weeks. Take
You
care,
got it.
everyone.
Thanks, Pete.
Everyone, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.